Hello everyone, this is Alex with Kodiak Woodcraft. In today's video, we're going to be building a big walnut lazy Susan. Now, I know what you're thinking. This is pretty much just a circle. How hard can it be to build? Well, while the project itself isn't that difficult, I'm going to be showing you some techniques that you can use to build this with precision. In other words, building it perfectly flat and perfectly round. I only have one ask of you. If you do find this video helpful, please go ahead and click that like button. Alright, that's enough of an intro. Let's build this thing. Alright, so this is how it all got started. I've had this piece of walnut for a while and I was waiting for the perfect project to use it on. This is one of those situations where you could probably get by with any sort of wood that you like. So even though this was a great piece of walnut, I had to do something about this big knot in the middle of the board. I didn't mind it at all from an aesthetic perspective, but I had to fill it so that it didn't create problems later in the project. I chose to use a 2-part epoxy, which I tinted black, so I mixed it up, filled it in, and then allowed it to cure for several days before I did anything else. Once I was confident that the epoxy had cured, I went ahead and skimmed it off using a combination of a belt sander and the planer, which you can see here. This was sort of an unnecessary step, as you'll soon see, but it was nice to see that the epoxy had settled into the cracks and filled them in nicely. So for this project, I was going to need to cut my board in half and then glue it back on itself in order to accommodate the full width of my Lazy Susan. Like I mentioned, this board was rough cut and it did not have a jointed edge. I started off by attaching a straight edge to my piece, and I wasn't afraid to screw right into the stock because the end was going to get cut off anyway. Once that was set up, I went ahead and routed straight along that guide all the way to the end of the board. I didn't bother cutting all the way through because I knew that I'd be circling back with a pattern bit to just trace the straight line that I had cut. Once this was done, I had a straight edge and I just had a little bit of tuning left to do with the hand plane. After getting that edge cut, I was ready to move on to the next part of the project, which was to cut the board in half and prepare for glue up. The only major point of consideration here was exactly where I wanted that knot to end up on the finished workpiece. I took a little bit of a risk and ended up putting it right on the edge, and it actually ended up looking really cool. Anyway, I made the cut and then I headed over to the table saw where I trimmed the boards down a little bit more. The only reason that this was necessary was to fit the entire glued up workpiece into a planing jig, which you'll see in just a moment. Once I had these two pieces ready to go, I took a look at what would soon become the glue joint. I ended up doing just a little bit more tuning with the hand planes and quickly became satisfied with the joint. It was time to glue them together. I went around and gathered all my clamps from around the woodshop, got everything staged up for the glue, and then I applied it to both boards. I made sure to spread out the glue really consistently, and I used this old paintbrush, which was way out of commission for painting, but perfect for glue-ups like this. From there, I proceeded to have a largely uneventful glue-up, which is always a good thing. I got these clamps dialed in, I got a nice line of squeeze out along the entire joint, and I just let the whole thing sit overnight. The next day, when I came back, I chiseled off that glue line and then set out to flatten this whole thing in my planer jig. So let me tell you about this thing. This jig is the best tool that I have at my disposal for flattening things, and I've used this in the past for cutting boards and all sorts of other projects. The idea behind this is to secure your workpiece between two parallel rails, and then to have a router sled that's not going to sag skim over the workpiece and cut the entire top off. Unless I'm trying to get the material to a specific thickness, I'm normally just trying to take off as little material as possible while still making sure that I've taken something off the entire top. That's the way that you get a consistent flat plane. There's a couple more things that I want to mention here, and a lot of it has to do with safety. So the first thing that you want to make sure of is that your workpiece is absolutely rock solid attached to the base, and that the base, wherever you may have that, is also secure. Normally what I end up doing is putting shims in the workpiece so that it can't rock whatsoever, and then I'll use some combination of hot glue and tape, like you can see in this video, to get everything locked down. When it comes to selecting a router bit, you do have several options, but I choose to stick with the more narrow straight bits or upcut spiral bits, as opposed to the large flat bottom planing bits that are actually sold. Even though it does take longer, I am personally more comfortable taking off just a little bit of material at a time. The last safety comment I have is that this jig generates a lot of dust. I'm always sure to wear my mask when I'm doing this. To be honest with you, this really isn't my favorite part of the project, just because it takes so long and it requires such concentration. But I stick with it just because it gets great results. Alright, so once I'm done with one entire side, I usually take a sander to it just to knock out the ridges really quick, and then I flip it over and do the whole thing again on the other side. The good news is, if you did your job flattening the top, you really won't have to do any shimming once you flip it over. Anyway, in my case here, I finished up the other side, cleaned myself off, and I had a perfectly consistent slab to work with on the rest of the project. Alright, so I had reached the point in the project where it was time to cut this into a circle. And I'm not sure if I just had enough of the router already, but I decided to do this on the table saw. I created this jig, which slides in the miter slot of the saw, and allows for the slab to pivot around a nail which has been placed in a very specific location on that jig. Basically, it's going to allow me to cut a circle on the saw. Anyhow, that's exactly what I did. I passed the slab through the blade many times, and I rotated it slightly with each pass in order to form that circle. You'll see when you watch these clips that it was far from perfect execution because there was quite a bit of burning that I experienced. I'll probably choose to use a different blade next time. The good news is, it didn't really matter at this stage because I was just looking to rough out the circle in the first place. I'm going to push these clips into light speed here so that you can get a sense for how this circle ultimately took shape. As you saw, I was taking big bites out of the circle in the beginning, but by the end, as the circle became more defined, the blade was really just skimming it. I had probably achieved the best circle I was going to get from the table saw, so I had to switch to a different method to fine-tune even further. That's when I made my way to the sander. Now, this actually worked really well, but the secret to the whole thing was the jig that I used, not the sander itself. I could pretty much guarantee you that if I had attempted to freehand this, I would have ended up making it worse, not better. Making this jig was really easy, and I actually reused the same one from the saw. All I did was take off the miter slot runner, and then I attached a stop to the underside of this platform so that I could never push the circle into the sander more than a fixed amount. That allowed me to have some movement, which was useful for easing into the sandpaper, without really ever being at risk of oversanding. I'm not sure if you'll be able to tell from the clips, but by the time that I was through this process, all of those burn marks were gone. The Lazy Susan was fully shaped and I was ready to move on to the next part of the project. My next task was to route an edge profile over the top side of the workpiece. I wanted to keep things as clean and simple as possible, so I went with a 45-degree chamfer bit. Even though I wasn't taking off that much material, I did take my time. I think it took me 5 or 6 different passes to get to my desired depth. By making the cuts incrementally, I was able to avoid tear out of any kind. Even though I wasn't done with the project yet, I'd reached the point where I wanted to get my brand burned into the wood. That's because I wanted to do it before sanding and before finishing. I went ahead and fired up my torch, branded the Lazy Susan, and then cleaned it all up with some sandpaper. Actually, at this point, I sanded the entire Lazy Susan to 220 grit, but I'm not going to make you watch that whole process. Alright, the next step in the build was finishing. I chose to use a wipe-on poly just because it's so forgiving and foolproof, and I actually put on 7 coats on both the top and the bottom. You're just going to see the first coat here, which was a little bit underwhelming, but as you saw from the intro and you'll see at the end of the video, it ended up looking really nice once there was several layers built up. I made sure to sand with fine grit sandpaper in between each coat just to make sure that there was no dust or anything like that in the finish. Alright, so now you're looking at this thing after that 7th coat has dried, and I'm getting ready to attach some mounting hardware to the bottom. I took advantage of this piece of scrap wood to mark a perfect circle around the board so that I knew exactly where the centered screws would need to go. I made sure to pre-drill for each of those screws right on the pencil line, and then I went ahead and attached the actual mounting hardware. This model in particular is by High Point, and they just call it their 17.5-inch Lazy Susan bearing. Apparently this particular model is a favorite amongst R2-D2 builders, so who knows, maybe we'll build R2 on this channel someday. Anyway, as you can see in the video, I went around and tightened down all these screws. I was careful not to go too crazy and torque them down too hard, and that was that. The base was attached. Alright everyone, well that's the build. Thanks for watching. Please make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so that you don't miss my next video. Thanks for watching.